A strategy doesn't need to be developed over the course of 6 months. Like, I think that's a myth in itself as well. It can be done quickly. It can be done in 30 days. It can be done in 2 days if you really commit to it. I tend to split my brand 50-50 to brand and demand gen. If it's a more mature company or kind of gaining some velocity, I'll usually go like a 70-30 demand gen to brand, or 80-20 demand gen to brand, and start to pivot a little bit. But you always have to have brand. You can't not have brand. You've got to be able to have them coexisting at the same time. KPIs, in my experience, are like snowflakes. There's no one that's the same for every company. It depends on the goal. It depends on what they're trying to accomplish. Depends on their budget. Most cybersecurity companies, and by the way, B2B large enterprise companies, are just having to work through, in terms of being creative, that it's not necessarily about email or paid anymore. It is about that high touch. How does that white paper differentiate itself? I think there is some validity in terms of Magic Quadrants or Forrester or whatever it happens to be in terms of justification. But is that going to be the driver for somebody to drive lead gen? Probably not. It's more than anything going to justify their decision. I think there's a lot of webinar fatigue. I think you get a lot of folks who actually, and I do this myself, think about yourself as in terms of yourself as the consumer. I sign up for a lot of webinars, but 9 times out of 10, by the time it actually comes around, I don't actually attend it. And I'll just be like, oh, I'll just get the recording and watch it. That ABM is a critical component to success if you know who your ICP really is and you're dialed in on them. I don't think any of these are necessarily going to go away, but I think it's just going to become either harder to differentiate and add value, or it's going to be more expensive. So we'll have to get creative. And I think on the creative side, maybe AI will help us figure out where those new points of creativity will come in. But they'll certainly help us from the perspective of efficiency and automation.
Let's get started, Julia. So thanks a lot for joining us. So tell us, what's some scattered marketing strategy and how does it look like?
At the core of a strategic marketing, scattered marketing strategy is random acts of marketing. And what I have found historically is that leaders or executives who may not have the marketing expertise are investing in distribution channels because maybe they've heard about them in an article or from a fellow colleague who owns or runs a similar type company, but it's really not aligned to the overarching goals of the company, the strategy that clearly has yet to be developed. There's likely no plan, and it's most likely not aligned to the budget. And so what ends up happening is that there is no data or feedback loop that provides that team or that executive or board, whoever it might be, any kind of measurement of the impact or performance that then leads to quality future decision making. So those random acts of marketing end up, at the end of the day, being typically a very large waste of time, money, and resources that are very critical to a business, particularly if it is early stage or if it is a rising star and needs to be very thoughtful about how budget and resources are being utilized.
Okay, that's awesome. So tell me, how do you come up with a structured process? So how would you start? How would you go about executing the business?
Sure. And this is the $150,000 question for most organizations. And I like to think about it as you think about the end, with the end in mind versus starting from the beginning, which for many folks is a challenge because they just want to jump in and get started. Again, particularly for maybe an early stage company or a growing company, they just want to get started. But I think of it like you're taking a trip with your friends. You would never just start designing a trip and say, this is where we're going, and this is the hotel, and these are the restaurants, and this is the food, and this is the activity. And you wouldn't think about, the other people that are participating in that trip. Of course, you would ask their opinion, what's of interest to them, what do they want to contribute? Are they allergic to some food, whatever it happens to be? and get their input, their preferences, what's their role in the trip, and plan it as a group. I think that the same thing happens when it's about developing a strategy. You're going to understand what the goal is. I think of it as like vision. What is the goal? What are the outcomes you're trying to get to? What's the strategy to support that vision? What's the structure or the tactical plan that will get you there? And then what are the results that you're getting? And if you aren't getting the results, you kind of need to back your wheel up to see if everything else has been clearly defined. And like I said, the trip is no different. You're going to get buy-in. What is the goal of this? What's the revenue we're trying to hit? What's the pipeline we're trying to hit? What is everybody contributing? What is sales contributing? What is customer success contributing? Marketing, upsell, cross-sell, etc. And then developing a strategy, typically 3 to 4 big rocks to support the goal of getting to that revenue number. And then each of those contributors developing a pretty tight plan, tactical plan to begin to execute against with KPIs along the way so that they have that roadmap of what they're trying to accomplish.
Okay, so you've mentioned the fact the strategy would have 3 to 4 big pillars, and care to sort of like elaborate deeply onto as to what those components are. So for any effective strategy to have any impact.
Great question. You're going to find that I love analogies, so I'll probably be using them throughout our conversation here today. But I think of those 3 to 4 big rocks similar to running a marathon. Nobody is going to get out of bed one day and just say, I'm going to run a marathon, and then suddenly they run the 26.5 miles or whatever it happens to be. I'm not a marathon runner, but they're going to think about what's the goals that they're going to need to do over the course of X period of time to get to that marathon. And again, it's likely 3 to 4 big rocks. Let's think about it again with this analogy of pace, nutrition, recovery, sleep, etc. And then how do you create a plan with each of those elements or those big rocks? So as your pace, you're going to think, okay, I've got 5 months to plan for this. So how do I increase my my pace as well as my distance? What's the nutrition I need to think through, etc. And I don't think that it's really any different than when you're thinking about a marketing strategy. And it's going to be different for every company. So those 3 to 4 big rocks for an established public company that is in healthcare is going to be very different than a strategy for a seed stage cybersecurity company. So this is where I go back to what is the goal? What is the revenue requirements? What are you trying to accomplish? Maybe there's a branding goal, etc. So in the sense of just in general, you're likely going to think through the strategy of some sort of brand component from a marketing perspective. Obviously, there's big rocks for every division. So for sales, customer success, etc. But in general, you're often going to think that there's going to be an element of the brand, then demand generation and demand capture. So you got to create the demand, but you also need to capture that demand that's going to drive the pipeline. Most often, there's also an element of operations that you need to think through, because that's where efficiency and scale and repeatability comes in. And then there might be another rock. It could be partnerships, channel play, maybe there's a content development. Again, and we'll talk about it here, I think, in just a few minutes, but as you come up with the goal, the strategy to support that goal will become clearer. So those big rocks will become clearer. What's going to drive you to get to that goal? And it's going to look differently, but typically you're going to find that there's usually going to be an element of brand, demand generation, operations, likely channel, and then maybe some kind of small pebbles surrounding it.
Oh, okay. That's awesome. That's awesome. So in terms of defining KPIs, so are there any particular your favorite KPIs to track those bigger pillars, or do you suggest any method of tracking those and measuring those also?
Well, KPIs at the end of the day and I'm using the phrase KPI very broadly. I think we need to look at what's the overarching financial goal, which is typically what most companies are shooting for. Then you have the metrics and the KPIs for that particular function. So for marketing, then you will have the KPIs for the big rocks that we just discussed. And then each of the tactical structural pieces will have metrics associated with them. And obviously all of this has leading and lagging components of the metrics and the data as well. Similar to the marketing strategy, and I'm not trying to be evasive, but KPIs, in my experience, are like snowflakes. There's no one that's the same for every company. It depends on the goal. It depends on what they're trying to accomplish. Depends on their budget. But in general, from my perspective, the financial goals are a giant math problem. You have to, if let's say you need 10 million in revenue or 100 million in revenue, you are going to back into that. So I mentioned a few moments ago, think about it with the end in mind. So if you know you need to get 100 million in revenue or $10 million in revenue, what's the pipeline that you need to get? Most companies shoot between 3.5 to 5x. So if you need 10 million in revenue, you're going to try and shoot for, again, using generic numbers, 50 million in pipeline. Then you need to think through who's contributing to that pipeline. Sales, marketing, customer service, channel. How much of that pipeline is every group? What's their slice of the pie? So then again, this is where the math starts to come into play. So if marketing then has a slice of that 50 million, and let's pretend that theirs is 15 of that 50 or 20 of that 50, then start creating the strategy that supports delivering that 20 million and the various tactics that will get you there. So then you start to back into how many leads do I need? How many accounts do I need to be? What's the transaction? What's the sales cycle? What's the cost? The average deal size? And then you start to come into the math, and then that helps you start to determine what are the tactics that are going to get you there. So for example, and I'm going to be extremist in this commentary with regard to KPIs, if you need to get 100 leads, you're likely not going to put an ad in your local newspaper because you're not going to get 100 leads. So you need to go where you're going to get that. And of course, where is your audience? So that's kind of the overarching component of the KPI question that you just asked. But then, as I said, as you're measuring and tracking these, you have to do that at a tactical level. So what is your SEO delivering from an inbound perspective? What is your paid media delivering? And you're going to be tracking and measuring every single one of those individually through your marketing tech stack. Again, and then as you review it, are you hitting the particular leading and lagging goals that you defined?
Let's just get deeper into the demand gen. So if
Sure.
you're sort of like now defining, okay, for demand gen, this is going to be a strategy, and these are going to be our tactics. And so how will you go about defining those? What's your structure like? You start with an ICP, where to find them, the channels. So just tell us about your process.
Again, I think I look at it from the perspective of demand generation and then demand capture. So how are you actually converting them? Because you can drive demand all the time, but if you're not actually converting them, then your funnel is going to start to get fat. But I think you hit the nail on the head with your question there, is that it all starts in the very beginning with regard to the position, the messaging, the position, the ICP, and then the message, because there's downstream impact that if you don't get that piece right, or if you do, by the way, it works both ways if you get it really right, how you define what you're going to do downstream, whether that's the events you attend, the analysts you engage, the campaigns that you create, the content that you create, is all rooted in that. So from the perspective of demand, and I'm not trying to, again, evade the question with regard to specifics, but again, it's going to look very different for every company with regard to how are they going to go out and capture that or generate that demand, and where, to your point, where are they? So if it is, for example, an open source, highly technical audience, you're likely not going to get them with paid media results, because that's likely, I mean, yes, they're humans and they're Googling, but that's likely where they're not consuming their content. So you're going to need to go, if it's a developer, an open source developer, your demand generation is going to come from hands-on workshops, technical workshops, maybe some more technical sites, or whether it's like a GitHub and your or a common room where you're experiencing driving that demand within a community, is going to look, again, very different to a company that is public that's selling toys. And that likely can leverage more common, like, business to consumer or business B2B or B2B2C elements of driving demand. So it's really is, where is your audience consuming content? Where are they engaging with content? And how can you get them to obviously convert? So you're going to have to be creating something that's compelling, that's going to make them want to engage. And again, it's going to look very different for every company.
So let's just go deeper and very specific. You work with cybersecurity startups, okay? So maybe we can talk very deeply for them. So you're creating a content engine for them to drive demand and all of that. So how would you start your process? What would you like to have with you in your arsenal that works particularly for the cybersecurity startups?
So when it comes to cybersecurity specifically, I go back to the personas, because there's two challenges I think that the cybersecurity community faces from a perspective of generalities as well as specifics tied to demand gen. One is, who is that audience? Some cybersecurity companies tend to be going towards extremely technical audiences who have skepticism around marketing. They don't want to engage until they're really ready. And then the other side of that tends to be folks who are targeting the CISO, the economic buyers of the company, the larger enterprise companies. So, again, the CISO, the VPs of information technology or security, etc. And they're having to work and cut through so much noise. For example, I was at RSA a few weeks ago, and I was talking to the CISO of one of the largest enterprise solar panel companies and producers and manufacturers. And she said that she and her CEO get upwards of 2,000 to 2,500 emails a week from marketing vendors. And so think about the noise that they're having to cut through. So as I think cybersecurity companies think through, again, if it's a very technical audience and they're looking through demand, what is that technical audience going to consume that's going to work against their natural skepticism, speaking in their language. And I'm getting kind of a little bit into the weeds here, which I think is what you want, but they don't like the typically super over-designed emails. They want that are, have a bunch of marketing jargon. They want to get into how is this going to help them get around, alert fatigue, or see their digital landscape in a more clear fashion, so they can see that the bad actors are coming in or not, etc. So how do you frame that campaign to speak their language and be where they are? On the cutting out of the noise, I think this is just a challenge that most cybersecurity companies, and by the way, B2B large enterprise companies, are just having to work through in terms of being creative. That it's not necessarily about email or paid anymore. It is about that high touch account, ABM, really looking at them of like, how can we get into the dark funnel when they're doing the research, when we can't see them, how to de-anonymize their information, and capture them when they're really looking before they come onto our radar, and then using tools, whether it be a Sixth Sense or demand-based or some kind of, intent provider, to be able to capture them sooner rather than later.
Okay. So you've identified their pain points. You identify, you want to get to their intents and everything, and now you want to touch with them. So is it something? This is where you add value, I would suppose. So in that value addition, do they like white papers more? Do they want to come to webinars? Do they want to read case studies? What would be the ideal mix of content that you want to work with?
I hate to say this because I just keep saying it depends, but it obviously depends. Again, I think if it's a more technical audience, I'll use an example from a company that I have worked for in the past that was one of my most valuable partnerships. Was a company called PeerSpot. And they are like the Google review, for lack of a better term, the Google review for very technical audiences. So again, you have to have, in that particular instance, you have to have a strong customer base because they want you to have a large portfolio of reviews, which means you need to have customers who are willing to speak on your behalf. And their reviews are upwards of 2,500 words, and they are very technical. So someone who's going, and it's demand generation in the sense that you have to have an account, you're going to log on, and it's a lead generator for the company that's posting the reviews. But the technical audience is going to come there looking for a technical answer, and you're not going to read 2,500 words of technical information because you don't have anything else to do. You are obviously actively looking and researching solutions and looking to your peers who are fellow technical audiences who have had experiences. And by the way, in this particular instance, they have a pro and a con. So you're getting what has been good about this particular cybersecurity technology, but what are some of the drawbacks? So in an instance like that content is extremely important because it's essentially a case study that's a technical win and or loss depending on the position of that particular provider. What I have experienced with regard to white papers, to answer part of your question, is how does that white paper differentiate itself? I think there is some validity in terms of Magic Quadrants or Forrester or whatever it happens to be in terms of justification. But is that going to be the driver for somebody to drive lead gen? Probably not. It's more than anything going to justify their decision. Is this person in the level of quadrant that I want? Do I want to be using the best of the best technology, or do I want to be using an emerging technology that might be in the upper right corner in 2 years? Maybe they want to be on the first side of it. But I'm also, in my experience, in finding that, again, cutting through the noise with things like white papers and research, not that it's not valuable, it is valuable, but there is a lot of it out there. So how do you help the consumer or the audience cut through that? I think webinars, again, these are my personal opinions and don't reflect that of every marketer, but I think that webinars, and I know you're not specifically asking about them, I think there's a lot of webinar fatigue. So I think you get a lot of folks who actually, and I do this myself, think about yourself as in terms of yourself as the consumer. I sign up for a lot of webinars, but 9 times out of 10, by the time it actually comes around, I don't actually attend it. And I'll just be like, oh, I'll just get the recording and watch it later. Do I really watch it later? Maybe 50% of the time. But I think it's where, going back to one of the other questions that you and I have discussed offline, which is creating that really integrated strategy and the integrated tactics that are going to cover a multitude of engagement points. LinkedIn obviously helps a lot if you're really trying to target an executive who's likely on LinkedIn a lot, and you can target the accounts, and there's a lot of ways for you to filter in how you're targeting them. Do I think a technical audience is there? Nope, but your economic buyer probably is. Going again to like what I was talking about with PeerSpot, you know, having a play there. Do you need to have SEO? SEO is table stakes these days. You have to. There's also an element that AI and things like Gemini and ChatGPT, people are using that more and more for search engines. So you got to have something there. So it's really how do you, and you can't deny that you also need to continue to have things like nurture programs so that people are being continually touched. Again, if it's a technical audience, they probably want a more hands-on workshop where they're going to maybe be able to code and create at that workshop and be able to test and utilize the technology that day, which will obviously entice them quite a bit more. Demos, of course, as you and I both know, having a high quality demo that if you can have it as self-service. So being able to provide all of these touch points really begins to dial into the integrated component of that strategy and those tactical plans.
Okay, that's awesome. So, you have worked with MSPs and SIs also. So how does all of this change when you go to this part of the world? I mean, do the principles still hold over there, or is it like a total different marketing tech strategy and tactics for MSPs and SIs?
Again, in my opinion, the principles are the same. The principles are, what is the goal of that company? What's the strategy that's needing to be created to support that goal? What's the tactical plan and the KPIs that are folded within that throughout that entire kind of cycle? I think you obviously have to, again, look at the perspective of who that ICP is and who those accounts are. Many of those MSPs and SIs tend to be generalists. Or they have a wide practice. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. They have a very large practice that may span cybersecurity, but it also may include hardware and software and some of your more traditional technologies. So there's an element there that goes back to the message and the positioning and the ICP that's required, that they might not be as technically savvy. Or they, I don't necessarily think that if they're an MSP with regard to the security component, because they probably are very technical. But again, how do you cut through the noise in terms of that they have a large practice that they're trying to promote and develop amongst them, you know, amongst their very wide customer base. But I do think that the principles hold true whether you're going after a cybersecurity company or if you're going after a channel organization, by the way, or an MSP. You know, you're going to deploy that kind of strategy, vision, strategy, structure, results principle.
Okay, but and I think you're right in terms of their broader audience and their broader offering. Because on the other hand, with the SaaS startups, it's a persona is easier to define, the pain points are easier to define, the value proposition are easier to define. Over here, it's so scattered, it's so many personas and so many offerings and so many value props. So how do you narrow it down? How do you narrow it down for SIs or MSPs? Okay, this is the way you should target your customers effectively, and this is how it should work. Because or you break it down into 10 different components, and every component has a different marketing strategy and a plan.
Yeah, sure. And I think you bring up a good point. And this almost aligns as well with a channel, or a, if you want to look at it from a VAR perspective, like a reseller standpoint. These organizations have, I used to work for a large reseller, cybersecurity reseller out of Denver. And back then they had something like 250 cybersecurity vendors on their line card. Like, again, you look through, how do you break through that noise? So I go, and I'm sure that most MSPs, and they might not have 250, but again, they have a very large line card across multiple technology sectors. So I think that breaking it down, I'd rather be specific and narrow than vague and broad. So in that instance of how do we really, if we're going through a reseller, for example, and again, I know you're saying MSPs, but I think the philosophy falls true for all three of those sectors, is how do you really dial into what you're trying to accomplish in a very narrow factor of value for that partnership or that relationship with that MSP, because not only are you having to break through the noise with the MSP in totality, but also then the audience that, again, if you're going so you're having to like double down, it's the marketing to versus marketing through, and here you're doing the to and the through. So being as specific as possible. And I think in this case, as you're developing your strategy, trying to do maybe 2 things really well versus 4 or 5 things in a mediocre fashion. And that's a good philosophy anyway, but maybe just being careful with how much you bite off, because you're having to double up your marketing activities as you market to that MSP or reseller or SI, and then through to their customers who are already experiencing a lot of noise, and they're being marketed to from a pretty aggressive perspective as well.
Okay, that's awesome.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It's a difficult one. I mean, just a difficult one.
Yeah, it is a difficult
crack.
Yeah.
So,
it's a difficult one to crack, but it's also, I think, especially from a distribution perspective for a small cybersecurity company, when you look at MSPs and SIs, and of course resellers in the channel, it's particularly the channel, it's a distribution, it's a distribution path for them that essentially could double or triple or quadruple their sales efforts, because they have other people who are marketing and selling on their behalf. That being said, that average Joe or Joanne are also selling the line cards of another 10 companies. So it's got its pros in the sense that you've expanded your sales efforts and your marketing efforts, but it's also challenging because you have to keep yourself top of mind with them all the time.
So let's just talk about the multi-channel plan. So an integrated multi-channel plan, how does it look like? How does a good one look like?
One of the things I think that's exciting about being a marketer, particularly in cybersecurity, because there's an element of innovation that's really happening there, is that I think that people forget about, is that marketing has anywhere between 5 and 8 sub-functions. And there's really not a lot of departments that have that. So if you look at a marketing leader and their team and their structure, they typically have brand, AR, PR, content, product marketing, demand. I call it growth, but growth, demand, operations, channel, social, whether that be paid or organic. So right there, I've just rattled off 9. So it becomes a really interesting puzzle to solve for, because you're not just coming in and saying, oh, I'm going to create an email campaign. You think about how all of those things work together. And earlier in our conversation, I said, you have to really have that position, ICP, and message, because there's downstream impact. So as I'm looking at assuming that we've gotten that component right, whatever right looks like or close, then I start to look at that integrated plan in terms of assuming, again, also we've gotten the math essentially right, or we know, directionally where we want to go. I start looking at, okay, here's our ICP and what are the events that we want to start going to? And are the accounts that we're trying to go after going to be at those events? And I understand sometimes events, you got to be there because you can't be conspicuously absent. People feel that way about RSA sometimes. And then there's the elements of maybe dialing back into some of the larger ones and actually going to some more focused events where your accounts are going to be there. Then looking at, again, that ICP, what does the content distribution look like? And I would combine some of this into the demand generation component as well, are we targeting accounts that we can capture on LinkedIn? Are there websites that have maybe it's a dark reading where you're doing a media buy where they can target accounts. Sometimes those sites they can't, but there's probably also a brand element there. There are many, I'm not a huge fan of content syndication, but it's a great way to get some volume if you are a growing or an early stage company that needs to kind of vet out and maybe not doing your net's a little wider versus just the sphere. So I'm looking at what are those distribution points of the content, both paid and organic. Obviously, as I said, SEO is table stakes. And then looking at other components of, again, is there a potential channel play where we can partner with some value-added resellers or some other partnerships or larger organizations or an MSP or whatever it happens to be, and then start looking at, I think that jumping into PR and AR, especially for early stage companies, is expensive and a risk. But if you are maybe leaning into the B and the C funding and getting a little more of that rising star and the high growth, then you start looking at, again, what's the message tied to the PR, on are there things that you're developing, maybe it's a demo or a platform, whatever it happens to be, that you can start leveraging into the AR and PR side. So you can see how it all kind of starts to funnel through into the various components. Obviously brand, however that may look, is going to be critical with, again, how you do your SEO, how you do your paid. We always hear that if you build it, they will come. That's not the case. We all know that. You have to actually let them know that you're there. So I tend to have a rule, if it is an early stage company, I tend to split my brand 50-50 to brand and demand gen. If it's a more mature company or kind of gaining some velocity, I'll usually go like a 70-30 demand gen to brand or 80-20 demand gen to brand, and start to pivot a little bit. But you always have to have brand. You can't not have brand. You've got to be able to have them coexisting at the same time. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, the thing that's at the fundamental or kind of supporting all of these efforts, even though it's not, quote, integrated, but it is integrated, is what does your operations look like? So how are you tracking all of this? How are you connecting it? Attribution, what's your attribution? What's your sales funnel with regard to defining all of your stages and the entry and exits of all of this? So that, going back to your very first question that we had, a little bit ago, is how do you make decisions going forward based on the impact and the performance and, of all of these things that you're doing from an integrated perspective. And it's being captured, and the data is helping you to drive the decisions in the future about how you spend the money. Because at the end of the day, this is all about return and driving pipeline, and doubling down on the things that work and getting out of the things that don't.
So for early stage companies, so most of the founders are technical founders and they lack marketing expertise. So how do you convince them first for obviously all of these marketing functions that need to have, and all of the budget that needs to be spent for things to happen, and especially for the brand part.
I'll go back to, again, it starts with a math problem of what you're trying to drive in terms of revenue and pipeline and the contribution being given by marketing. Most of the companies that I have worked for have been early stage startups. So I've been a part of 7 in my career in totality, both in cybersecurity as well as in the financial sector. And I think it comes down to 2 things. One is creating that strategy. And I think there's a myth, particularly with early stage founders and CEOs, is that just jump in and go. But in this instance, it's good to take a beat. A strategy doesn't need to be developed over the course of 6 months. Like, I think that's a myth in itself as well. It can be done quickly. It can be done in 30 days. It can be done in 2 days if you really commit to it. But taking that beat and pausing and creating a strategy that then has a more tactical plan aligned to your budget, it's this concept of slow down to go fast. And if you take that beat, you do a little bit better planning, you're utilizing your resources, both money and people, in a more effective manner, and you're likely not going to waste as much money. The other component, so I said there were 2 components. One is the development of the strategy. The second is constant education. So as they have marketing leaders, I think it's critical for these marketing leaders who most of them have upwards of 10, 15, 20 years of experience, is that they are in a constant state of educating their colleagues and peers about what marketing can do and what it actually is. I think we've moved beyond the concept of marketing as just arts and crafts and making things look pretty. And there's an element of understanding that it's arts and craft and a very serious science. One of the largest functions to own in data is the marketing function. So educating the CEO or the founder, as well as your peers, your sales peers, your operational peers, your CFO, for goodness sakes, the CFO really cares what you're doing. But educating them on the trends, how the data can be utilized to make decisions, the importance of that data, and investing in the technology to ensure you have good data flow, as well as reporting. And it's a constant, I wouldn't say it's a battle, because I don't think of it as a battle. I think they're legitimately interested in learning. But it's how do you navigate and influence people and persuade people about, I've got subject matter expertise in this space. Here's the data that shows it. I need you to trust me as the subject matter, and I'll continue to educate you, and we'll go forth, we'll go forth and prosper. But it is a constant and regular battle. And then finally, I know you asked about the brand. The brand to me is, again, part of the overarching strategy. So there tends to be an early stage this desire in which to over-rotate into the brand, and I understand that. And then sometimes I agree with it. But again, you can't have brand without demand hand in hand. So the weighting of the budget may be, in the beginning, as I said, I typically go 50-50. One of the companies I was at recently, I was probably more at like a 60-40, leaning into the brand, because they really needed to get their name out there. So if it's an early stage, you might be maybe not overextending, but rotating a little bit into the brand because you need to bring your name up. But over time, as you need to drive revenue, you're going to have to make that shift and either balance it out, or then, as I said, as you start to grow and gain some momentum and velocity, dial a little bit more into the demand side. But at the end of the day, having a good strategy and continuing to educate your CEO, founder, and peers will go a long way, with it all being rooted in data.
So in terms of your preferred MarTech stack, and maybe your minimum viable MarTech stack, what would that include?
Sure. I won't use brand names because I think that they're everybody has their preferences, and candidly, you're probably getting tired of me saying this. It depends, because you're going to go to one company and they're going to have one thing, and then you're going to go to the next company and they're going to have something else. But I think at the end of the day, typically a company is going to need some sort of marketing automation stack, whether that be Marketo, HubSpot, or Pardot. They'll also likely need, if they're not using one of those three, they'll need some sort of email system. Again, some folks invest in just like a constant contact or something, and that will serve as their marketing automation until they get a larger budget and they can actually invest in that. Then you have the table stakes with regard to Google and your Google ads, and your tracking of your SEO. And then you likely are going to need, if you're not already, which most companies are, they're going to have a Salesforce or some sort of CRM that you're going to want and need to have your automation tools connected through. And then it really becomes, after you have some of these basics, it really becomes what is needed by the business. So some companies, I encourage them to leverage a chat functionality, because if somebody is on your site, you want to be able to capture them and engage them right away, because they're there for a reason. I'm not including, obviously, every company needs some sort of website, and we haven't even touched on the digital component of your website as a digital product, and it needs to be maintained and drive conversion. So it's not there just to have information, but how do you, using your website in which to convert people throughout the entire funnel, top, middle, and bottom. So obviously, whether that's WordPress or some other provider, and how that's also connected to your marketing automation tool. And then of course, and people might debate whether or not this is a marketing piece of the marketing tech stack, or if it's a piece of the sales, some sort of outreach program, whether it is outreach, in which the SDRs or the BDRs can be doing their outreach, and that can also be connected through to your marketing automation and in your CRM. Sometimes that sits in sales, depending on what that happens to be. But I think after you have some of the basics like marketing automation, email, social, both paid and organic through Google, it then just becomes what the company is, leveraging in terms of their tactics and their strategy to support that. Some folks also use, I think this is a valuable and an inexpensive component, is thinking through your social media postings using a provider like Bamboo or something like that, in which to not only post your social, but also get your employees an easy centralized location in which to help support the brand voice and getting that out there. If you can and you can afford it. And I think there's some inexpensive options that are coming out there, but if you can get some sort of intent provider, Zoom has got some things that they've been coming out with, Rollworks. If you can't afford like a 6-sensor demand base, which can get pricey, but I think there's some nice alternatives out there, especially if you have an ABM, a strong ABM play. That's critical.
So seems like ABM is the answer. So you seems like, is ABM still working? Are you a fan of it? What are your thoughts about that?
I'm skeptical of saying anything is the answer, because that goes back to our conversation about having real integrated strategy and plan. That being said, I think that ABM is a critical component to success if you know who your ICP really is and you're dialed in on them. It is a much more efficient, effective use of resources, both people and financial, to know who those accounts are and take advantage of that. That being said, I think there are very few companies that are really dialed in and getting that right that aren't either public or large enterprise. It is when when it comes to ABM, you metric it differently, you collect data differently, your reporting looks different than your standard lead to opportunity. So I think it's a challenge sometimes for smaller and mid-sized companies to really get it right. And what I find in going back to your original statement of like the answer, what I find is those early stage and growing companies, even mid-market, they're doing a version of both. They're doing both casting of the wide net from an outbound perspective and trying to, not wanting to lose something. There's probably an element of fear of missing out, a little FOMO there, and they're doing ABM. And I think some of that, again, this is my opinion, I think some of that is that the tech stack is set up and has been developed over the course of the last 10 to 15 years to cater to the traditional demand gen of casting a wide net. And it's very difficult to ask companies, especially if they're mid-market and have been established, to essentially either rip out or start their tech stack over again to cater to ABM. So there's a lot of kind of plug and play, or just trying to figure out how do you make your current tech stack be able to accommodate what I would say ABM is fairly new in the relevancy of, marketing in totality. Over the course of the last 5 to 7 years, how do you make your current tech stack without having to make huge investments go to the ABM? So I think that is a challenge that companies have to think through. But as I said, when it comes to the strategy of ABM, and if your ICP really warrants it and leans into knowing what those target accounts are, I think it's a much more effective use for resources, budget, and time, because you know exactly who you're going after. And if you get some, some walk-ins, great, that's icing on the cake. But focusing in on the ABM certainly is, particularly for early stage companies, I think much more effective use of their resourcing.
Oh, okay, that's awesome. So let's okay, we're coming close to the time, so I'm just looking at it. So which channels and which tactics do you see are dying right now, and you think that, okay, this used to work and will not work anymore? What some of the emerging trends that are coming up right now?
Well, I couldn't be a technologist without saying AI, of course, because that's what everyone's saying right now. I think for marketing specifically, AI is one of the greatest, I think AI specifically is one of the greatest advancements for marketers that has come out in many, many years, from the standpoint of automation, efficiency, and accuracy. Obviously, AI, and I'm speaking about AI in terms of generative, so like a ChatGPT or Gemini. I keep wanting to call it the old name, but Gemini. Those tools are enabling marketers to be more efficient in their time. So it's not the end all be all, but in terms of automation, content creation, ideation, it's a game changer. Also, I have to say, it requires human oversight due to accuracy. So it is, again, not the end all be all with regard to it's going to replace anybody. I think it's just going to make everyone a little bit more efficient. I think the other thing that is being discussed in the communities that I'm a part of, particularly for marketing leaders, is how is AI going to change search? That has been, I don't think we've quite figured that out yet. I don't think a lot of people have quite figured it out, but more and more people, as I mentioned earlier, are going to these tools and utilizing them as a search function. Versus just going to Google, and how does that impact SEO going forward and organic? again, I think that is yet to be determined, but it is certainly part of the discussion that I'm a part of several marketing executive communities, and that is certainly top of mind. I think on things that necessarily aren't going out of style or are going to go away, but I think are the larger challenge is email marketing. And that's a very contentious conversation because some people say email marketing still has a strong play and it is a critical component in terms of getting folks to engage. My personal opinion, and does not represent that of everyone, is that it's too noisy. I think most people are ignoring their emails for the most part until it really becomes either too painful or they're really giving a directive by their senior executive teams in which to start engaging on a specific search. Then I think it becomes a little more valuable, but I think it's a tougher play. I think paid is, again, something that will always be there, paid media or paid search, but it's getting more and more expensive with less and less result. So I think companies are going to have to evaluate what kind of investments they're going to be making, because at the end of the day, we all know the people with the biggest budgets are the people who are going to win on the paid front. So, if you're an early stage cybersecurity company, how do you compete with Cisco or CrowdStrike or I'll say Wiz now that they've gotten a large investment? Like, it's very difficult. It's going to be harder and harder to compete with that without just spending a large amount of money. And I would say that also leans into things like LinkedIn. Marketers over the course of the last few years have really invested quite a bit because LinkedIn allows you to really target your ICP. That being said, it's kind of becoming like email, where a lot of people are being targeted in LinkedIn, and it's becoming a tough place to differentiate yourself. So I don't think any of these are necessarily going to go away, but I think it's just going to become either harder to differentiate and add value, or it's going to be more expensive. So we'll have to get creative. And I think on the creative side, maybe AI will help us figure out where those new points of creativity will come in. But they'll certainly help us from the perspective of efficiency and automation.
So do you agree to the fact that marketers ruin all the channels that used to work and then they stop working?
I would never say that as a marketer myself. I don't think that we ruin it at all. I think that I don't think that we, I think we're just challenged with the noise. And I think there's also a level of, and this goes back to strategy and why I lean so heavily on the strategy as well as the buy-in, which we didn't talk too much about, but ensuring that there's buy-in and you stay the course is sometimes, I think that's the fear of missing out, is marketers will kind of go like this because they're like, oh, here's the next new hot thing, or here's this thing isn't working, so I'm going to pull everything out and go over here. This is where data comes into play about helping make decisions about what really is working versus what's perceived to be working or not working. And then staying the course with regard to whether the hot new thing is or the thing that's going out of style. And utilizing the data and the information to make that informed decision versus, hey, my buddy told me on a golf course that now I need to pull all of my money out of paid search and I now need to go into billboards. So I don't think we've ruined it, but I think that we can be stewards of how the data helps us make informed decisions and instills a sense of security and a sense of stability in staying the path. And obviously being opportunistic where you need to be, but using that data to just really drive those decisions and kind of cut out the rest of the noise.
Okay, so that's really awesome. So I think, Julia, so this is about time. So I truly loved our conversation. I've actually learned a lot. So there are quite a few questions were just for my personal reason. So where can people know and learn about you?
I thank you. I appreciate our time, and I'll also just say off record, if we need to do any more or answer any more questions, just let me know. I'll wear the same shirt and we can have some continuity and add anything else.
Yeah. I think because I feel like we can actually utilize one more session.
Yeah, if you guys want to, I'm happy to do that. So in terms of where people can find me, I am a fractional CMO helping early stage cybersecurity companies, particularly those with a minimum of 2 million ARR, as well as MSPs and SIs that we talked about, helping them develop the marketing strategies that we just chatted through, as well as the tactical plans, and overseeing and helping their internal teams execute against that. You can find me at igniteb2bgrowth.com, which is my website. Of course, I'm also on LinkedIn. Like most folks, you can find me at my name, Julia Wiltshire. And those are the two best places to reach out to me. So that's where you can find me. And thank you for your time. I am passionate about the subject of marketing. I've been a B2B marketer for 20 plus years, and I could talk about this all day long. And then you couple it with the importance of cybersecurity and how it's protecting both Wall Street and Main Street. It's a very important topic. So we want to ensure that people stay safe. So I could talk about marketing and cybersecurity all day long. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. I think maybe the next session will be around this. So next session should be around cybersecurity and marketing and cybersecurity domain. I think that should be very
great.
Interesting.
Yeah, I'd love that.
Yeah, always. We'll stay connected and we'll talk a lot more. Okay.
All right, sounds good. Take care. Have a good rest of your day.
Okay. Have a nice day. Bye.
You too.